The screaming stopped at 2:14 a.m. on June 3rd, 1834. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in tavern fights or the quick, panicked cry of a sailor falling overboard. It was something longer, wetter, the kind of sound that claws at the edge of sanity, as though the lungs themselves were tearing apart while still inside the body. The kind of scream that can't be forgotten once it lodges itself in memory, echoing for years like a bell tolling inside a skull. When it finally ceased, the silence that followed was worse. A silence so heavy, so absolute, it felt as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. What happened in those final moments aboard the brigantine Mercy of Providence would remain hidden beneath the rolling Atlantic swells for nearly 2 centuries. Buried not under earth, but under waves, locked in the abyss where sunlight never reaches. And yet, stories like these don't stay buried forever. They drift. They resurface in whispers carried by dockhands, in hushed confessions muttered in taverns at the edge of the world, and in the journals of men who swore never to speak aloud of what they had witnessed. This isn't just another shipwreck story. It isn't about storms or cannon fire or navigational errors. This is a tale of how hunger and desperation can transform men into monsters, and how the sea, patient as stone, swallows secrets until it is ready to give them back. The Grey Shoals, that treacherous patch of water off the Atlantic routes, has never been charted properly for one simple reason. The sea doesn't want it to be. It prefers its mysteries intact. The wind that night howled like a dying choir across the shoals, shrill and uneven, as if the air itself disapproved of what it was forced to witness. Each gust carried with it the sting of brine and something else, something fouler. The sour stench of blood, already beginning to rot in the night air. The ocean, usually a blank sheet of black under a new moon, shimmered with a ghostly light. Phosphorescent plankton, stirred by the ship's desperate rolling, painted every swell in pale green streaks. To the crew, it looked like the sea itself was glowing, like the water was alive and waiting, like some vast stomach eager to be filled. On deck, prayers had long since been abandoned. The men had muttered them for weeks, perhaps months, but the words had thinned into nothing more than habit. By that final night, no one bothered with scripture. They didn't need words from heaven. They needed bread or meat or anything that would make their hands stop shaking and their bellies stop growling with that relentless gnawing sound. The deck timbers, soaked through with salt and spume, absorbed more than seawater. They absorbed the ragged groans of the dying and the quick, high whimpers of the weak. Screams soaked into that wood the way ink seeps into old paper, leaving behind stains invisible to the eye but carved into memory all the same. Sailors who later passed over the same cursed coordinates swore the mercy of Providence could still be heard on nights when the wind shifted east. Groans rising and falling with the tide. Nails scratching at invisible planks. Faint cries, cut short. Nothing visible, only the sound of a ship that had been claimed and refused to rest. Captain Elias Granger, a man of 41 years who had seen the worst tempests of the Atlantic, stood rigid at the rail that night. His eyes, bloodshot from weeks without proper rest, searched the horizon, though he knew there was no salvation out there. His blistered hands gripped the splintering wood so tightly that the grain carved itself into his palms. Granger had commanded men through cannon fire, had sailed ships crippled by shot and storm, but none of that prepared him for the thing now uncoiling inside his crew. Hunger eats differently than bullets. It eats slow. It gnaws until a man's mind is chewed as hollow as his belly. At the beginning, when they left Liverpool, they had been 40. 40 men singing as the sails filled. 40 men dreaming of wages, of homecomings, of ports where the air smelled less of tar and more of ale. By June, less than half remained, not claimed by scurvy, nor swept overboard, nor felled by enemy shot. No, something else had eaten through their number. Something worse than storm, more methodical than cannon fire. It was hunger first, and then something beyond hunger. The Grey Shoals had always carried a reputation. Mariners muttered about them as if they were alive, as if the waters themselves resented intrusion. Charts grew vague the closer you sailed, depths shifting without warning. Safe currents gave way to eddies that pulled ships sideways, as though unseen hands were dragging hulls toward darker waters. And yet Granger had chosen the shortcut, a dangerous gamble to shave weeks off the voyage, to deliver cargo quicker, to earn the owner's favor. He told himself it was necessity, that the merchants demanded speed. But necessity, at sea, is usually just another word for greed. By the second week adrift in those waters, the sea itself began to change. The fish they hauled up weren't ordinary catches. They weren't herring or cod or mackerel. They were pale, slick things with too many teeth. Creatures that twitched even after gutted, their eyes rolling like coins at the bottom of a well. The cook swore the things hissed when he cut them open, though the men laughed it off nervously. The whales came next. They didn't breach or blow. They circled, days on end, circling the brig in silence, their great grey backs rolling just beneath the waves. Parishioners waiting for communion. When the first mate vanished, it was easy to blame the night watch. He must have stumbled in the dark, gone overboard. But sailors read decks the way hunters read the ground, and the planks bore marks that told a different story. Streaks of blood. Grooves where nails had clawed desperately at the rail. The truth was clear to any man willing to see it. Something had dragged him away, and it wasn't the sea alone. By that point, the biscuit barrels were crawling more with weevils than bread. Hunger makes men cruel. It makes them suspicious, and it makes them inventive in ways polite society prefers never to mention. By the third week, the crew could no longer pretend. Their eyes sunken, their cheeks hollowed, they began to see each other not as brothers, not as fellow souls bound together against the storm, but as shapes, as meat. That was when the sea offered its first cruel bargain. A body rose from the water one morning, bobbing against the hull as if placed there. Not the bloated wreck of a drowned man, but too intact, too fresh. The sailors muttered about burial rites, about prayers, about the dignity of the dead. But none of those words filled their stomachs. What they spoke of, what their eyes fixed upon, was fire, knives, flesh. 17 sailors ate that night, and for the first time in weeks, they slept without the gnawing ache of hunger waking them every hour. But the sea is patient, and it keeps accounts balanced. It does not give without taking. Captain Elias Granger had always known that the sea demanded sacrifice. He had seen it take men with brutal efficiency, snatching them in storms, swallowing them in sudden squalls, pitching them into the deep without warning or pity. But what the sea demanded on the Grey Shoals was something different, something that stretched the very definition of survival until it tore. He was not a coward. Nor was he the kind of man who reached for scripture in times of trial. Granger was a seafarer of the old stripe, disciplined, pragmatic, superstitious only in the way sailors must be, because to sail without superstition is to invite madness. He carried a silver coin drilled through the center and tied to a leather cord around his neck, a charm against drowning given to him by a woman in Dublin years earlier. He rubbed it each dawn out of habit, as though it might remind the sea that it already owned his luck, and therefore had no need to take his life. But even charms, even prayers, even skill, none of it mattered once the mercy of Providence drifted into the shoals. To understand the curse that settled on his ship, you must first understand the man. Elias Granger was no reckless youth. He had earned command through decades of service. He knew the routes from Bristol to Boston, from Lisbon to the Indies. He knew how to trim a sail to squeeze speed from a breath of wind, how to read the roll of waves to anticipate weather, how to keep men working long past the limits of their bodies with a barked order and a hard stare. He was respected, feared, and in the way sailors sometimes are, loved by his crew. Not tenderly, but with the loyalty that comes from knowing your captain will not break when you need him most. But even men like Granger bend under the weight of commerce. The shipowners in Liverpool had been clear. The voyage was to be swift, the profits maximized. There were whispers of competitors securing faster passages, and the Grey Shoals, though dreaded, offered a shortcut. Shave weeks off the journey, arrive with goods fresher, pockets heavier, and reputations burnished. Granger told himself he had no choice. But choices at sea are always a matter of risk, and the risk he chose would damn them all. The shoals announced themselves not with storm clouds or jagged rocks, but with subtle disquiet. Compasses spun lazily. Depth soundings contradicted themselves. A chart read 30 fathoms, yet the lead sank only 10 before striking sand. A steady breeze became erratic, pushing the brig in circles as though the wind itself conspired against progress. The crew muttered. Seasoned sailors know when water feels wrong. They spoke in half-sentences, in glances, in the careful silence of men who sense they've trespassed where they are not wanted. And then there were the fish. Pale, slick things with mouths too wide, caught in nets that should have hauled cod. Their scales shimmered faintly in the lantern light, as though coated in oil. Their eyes, lidless and round, seemed to follow the men even after death. The cook swore one let out a hiss as his knife slid into its belly, a noise like air escaping from a wound. No one laughed at him. They only turned away and ate in silence, chewing the flesh without pleasure, knowing that refusing food was not an option. The whales came next. For days they followed, surfacing in silence, circling without breaking pattern. They did not spout. They did not dive. They only glided, immense shadows just beneath the surface, watching. Their sheer size should have been awe-inspiring, but their stillness was worse. It felt like being judged. When the first mate vanished, the story given was simple. He fell. A misstep, perhaps a line snapped, perhaps a gust took him. But Granger had seen the deck. He had seen the blood. Thin streaks across the planks, claw marks on the rail where fingers had dug in desperately, resisting something that pulled him outward. Men fall from ships every year. They do not leave scratches like that. The mate had not fallen. He had been taken. By what? No one dared to name. Granger tried to hold discipline. He ordered watches doubled, lanterns trimmed, rigging inspected. But hunger undermines discipline faster than mutiny. The biscuit barrels, once their comfort, now rattled with more insects than grain. The salted pork had rotted in its cask. Water casks grew green with slime. Men eyed each other with the suspicion of wolves circling wolves. Still, Granger carried himself as if nothing had changed. He kept his uniform coat brushed, his boots clean, his silver charm polished. He ate with the crew, though his portion was no larger than theirs. He thought discipline would preserve their humanity. But humanity, like bread, crumbles quickly when starved. By the third week in the shoals, the men no longer spoke of rescue. They spoke of flesh. Not openly, not at first. But in sidelong looks, in the way knives lingered too long in hands, in the way they stared at the weakest among them. When a body surfaced, drifting alongside the hull, too intact, too fresh, the decision was made without words. Burial rites were forgotten. The fire was lit. The knives came out. 17 men ate that night. Granger did not stop them. Perhaps he could not. A captain can command against mutiny. He can command against fear. But he cannot command against hunger. Hunger makes orders into air. Hunger makes even loyalty bow its head. So Granger ate as well. Not because he wanted to, but because refusing would make him other, separate, marked. And a captain who is separate is no captain at all. Afterward, the sea responded. The next morning, the waters churned red with dead fish. Thousands floated belly up, poisoned by nothing visible. The men said it was a curse, that the sea itself was spitting back their crime. But they kept eating. Once the line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. Appetite is like a wound. It deepens when picked. From that point on, the ritual was set. Lots were drawn. A man was marked. The others fed. It was brutal, yes, but systematic. The sea itself seemed to encourage it. Fish appeared after each death. The whales circled closer, as though waiting their turn. Granger tried to believe he was preserving some order, that by structuring the horror, he kept it from descending into chaos. But in truth, the order only hid the madness. On deck, Under the sickly glow of plankton, 17 gaunt men clung to life. Their ribs sharp, their eyes wild, their lips cracked from salt and thirst. And in the center of it all stood Captain Elias Granger, silver charm cold against his chest, staring at a horizon that never changed, a sea that gave nothing freely, and a curse that he himself had invited. The first signs of what would unravel the mercy of Providence did not arrive all at once. Disasters rarely do. They creep in quietly, little fractures at first, hairline cracks in wood, and spirit that widen with each passing day until the whole vessel, body, mind, ship alike, splits apart. At first, it was only the food. Sailors expect their rations to sour with time. Biscuit goes hard, salted meat grows rancid, water takes on a swampy taste. But what the crew found in their stores was worse than ordinary spoilage. The biscuit barrels weren't merely stale, they were alive. Weevils wriggled through every crumb, so thick that the bread seemed to move of its own accord. Men tried to shake them out, to scrape the surface, but hunger forces choices. Soon, they simply ate the insects with the bread, grinding them into paste between their teeth. It was nourishment of a sort. The pork was worse. Casks that had been sealed tight now reeked when opened. The brine was clouded, the meat slick with rot. Even those who had chewed leather straps to calm their hunger gagged at the smell. Some swore the meat twitched when sliced, though whether from maggots or imagination none could say. The water, too, betrayed them. At first, it grew green and slimy, a film across the surface. Then it began to stink. No matter how tightly the casks had been bound, something had gotten in, something that turned the life-giving liquid into poison. Captain Granger ordered rationing, but the word was meaningless. What cannot feed a man cannot sustain him, no matter how carefully divided. The crew obeyed outwardly, yet inwardly they grew restless. Sailors muttered that the stores had not spoiled naturally. The shoals had done it. The sea itself had corrupted their provisions as punishment for daring to cut through its hidden territory. Then came the catch. Nets that should have pulled cod and mackerel brought up pale, eel-like fish with wide mouths and translucent flesh. Their bodies glowed faintly in the night, lit by veins that pulsed like lantern wicks. When gutted, they bled a dark ichor, thick as tar, staining hands and knives. The cook swore he heard one hiss, a sound like steam escaping from a kettle, though the others told him he was mad. Yet none laughed. Their silence spoke louder than agreement. Some men refused to eat the things. They spat them out, muttering that no creature of God bled tar. Others, too hungry to argue, chewed them down grimly. Their bellies filled, but their eyes turned glassy afterward, as if the meal had numbed them rather than nourished. The sea life grew stranger still. Whales appeared, but not like those sailors celebrated in songs. These did not breach or spout. They circled, vast shapes gliding silently just below the surface. Their immense bodies rolled in unison, surrounding the brig as though drawing an invisible boundary. They made no noise, gave no sign of aggression, but their presence weighed heavier than cannon fire. Sailors whispered that the whales were waiting like priests at a funeral, waiting for a body to arrive. The tension aboard the ship thickened. Sleep grew shallow, restless. Every groan of the timbers, every slap of a wave, every whistle of wind was amplified into omen. Men began to mutter charms under their breath, old scraps of prayers, phrases in tongues half forgotten. They hung trinkets on the rigging, bits of bone, carved wood, coins pierced and tied with twine. A desperate patchwork of superstition, as though the shoals might be appeased by a necklace of trinkets swaying in the wind. It was in this atmosphere of dread that the first mate vanished. His name was Samuel Kerr, a stout man with a booming voice, the kind who could curse an entire crew into working harder without raising his hand. He had been with Granger for 5 voyages, loyal, steady, unafraid of storm or fight. On the night he disappeared, he had been pacing the deck, lantern in hand, watching the horizon. A routine inspection, nothing unusual. By morning, only the lantern remained, rolling slowly in the scuppers. The official story was quick and simple. He fell. A misstep, a loose line, a gust of wind. Such things happen at sea. But Granger saw the deck. He saw the scratches carved into the rail, deep gouges as if made by fingernails. He saw the smear of blood that trailed across the planks. A man who falls leaves no scratches. A man dragged leaves marks. And Kerr had been dragged. No one spoke it aloud. No one needed to. The silence said everything. Men began to look. After Kerr's disappearance, the mood shifted from fear to paranoia. Watches were doubled, then tripled, though the men watched each other more than the sea. Whispers spread in the dark. Some said the captain had done it, sacrificed his mate to appease whatever haunted the waters. Others said Kerr had been taken by the whales circling silently below, that they had grown tired of waiting. A few muttered the darkest suspicion of all, that the crew themselves had taken him. The truth was simple. Hunger had already sunk its claws into them. Men grow savage when bellies are empty and days stretch without relief. They begin to see not people, but portions, not shipmates, but sustenance. And once such thoughts take root, they spread like rot in a barrel of apples. It was not long before the sea itself seemed to offer them what they lacked. One morning, the lookout cried down from the foremast. A body. At first, they thought it must be Kerr, returned by the water. But when they hauled it close, the corpse was too fresh, too intact. A stranger, adrift in the current, face pale but unmarked. No wounds, no rot. His clothes suggested a sailor, but from which ship none could guess. Perhaps he had fallen overboard from another vessel. Perhaps the Shoals had delivered him as an offering. There was talk of burial, of prayer. The captain even ordered a shroud prepared. But men who have not eaten in days cannot think of souls. They think only of flesh. And so knives came out. A fire was lit. 17 sailors ate that night. They did not speak as they ate. They did not meet each other's eyes. They chewed in silence, in shame, in relief. And for the first time in weeks, they slept. The next morning, the sea answered. The water around the brig churned red, fish floating belly up by the hundreds. No wound, no net to explain it. Just death, spread across the waves like a slick. The crew stared in silence. Some muttered that the sea was punishing them. Others whispered that it was feeding alongside them. From then on, nothing was the same. The rituals began small. Draw lots, mark a man, eat. It was whispered at first, done reluctantly. But repetition dulls horror. By the second time, the process was smoother. By the third, it was expected. By the fourth, it was tradition. The mercy of Providence was no longer a ship. It was a floating butcher's block. And Captain Elias Granger, once the pillar of discipline, no longer barked orders. He merely watched, silver charm cold against his chest, as his men slipped into the oldest law of all, the law of survival. Hunger is a strange thing. It begins as a whisper, a complaint in the stomach, a dull ache that can be ignored with effort. But left unanswered, it grows louder. It shifts from a complaint into a command. Muscles weaken, thoughts blur, patience shortens. And then, in time, hunger becomes not a feeling at all, but a lens through which the world is seen. Every movement, every glance, every shape becomes food, or not food, sustenance or waste, friend or meal. By the time the mercy of Providence drifted into her fourth week in the Grey Shoals, hunger had made its home among the crew. It sat at their table, walked with them on deck, whispered in their ears at night. Men woke not from dreams of family or fortune, but from visions of roasting meat. Even the rats, once despised, had long since been caught and eaten. Their bones cracked between desperate teeth, their hides boiled into thin broth. When the last rat disappeared, the silence that followed in the ship's hold felt heavier than cannon fire. The sailors' faces grew gaunt. Skin clung to bone. Eyes sank deep into their sockets, staring with the hollow intensity of men already half dead. They spoke less. Words, after all, require energy, and energy was in short supply. Instead, they communicated with gestures, with the briefest flicker of eyes, with the silence of shared suffering. It was in this silence that the sea delivered its cruel gift. A body. At dawn, the lookout's voice cracked across the deck. A shape in the water. At first they thought it a log or a broken spar, but as it drifted closer, they saw the pale face, the limp arms trailing behind. A man floating on his back as if laid gently upon the water. They hauled him aboard. His skin was cool, but not bloated. His eyes shut, but his face strangely peaceful. There were no signs of rot, no teeth marks, no decay. He could have died hours ago, or days. It was impossible to tell. He was impossibly fresh. Captain Granger ordered a shroud prepared. Sailors muttered of burial rites, of prayers, but their voices were weak, their eyes restless. No one reached for rope or canvas. Instead, their gazes lingered on the body in a way that needed no words. The first knife was drawn slowly, almost reverently. A murmur of protest rose, but it died quickly. Hunger does not argue. Hunger does not debate. It commands. And one by one, 17 sailors obeyed. They lit a small fire on the lee side, shielding it from the wind. The smell of smoke rose first, then the sharper, darker scent of meat. Some turned away, gagging, but their bellies dragged them back. When the flesh was ready, they tore it with bare hands. No plates, no ceremony, just silence and chewing, grease on fingers, blood-staining lips. Not a word was spoken that night, only the sound of gnawing, the crack of bone, the low hum of the fire. Shame hung heavy, but shame does not fill a stomach. And when at last they lay down, bellies warm for the first time in weeks, they slept. Some even smiled in their sleep, as though children again, full after supper. Morning brought no relief. The sea itself seemed to react. Around the ship, the water churned red. Fish floated belly up, thousands of them, lifeless and stinking. No nets had been cast, no poison poured. It was as though the ocean had mirrored the men, taking life as they had. Some whispered that it was punishment. Others insisted it was a sign of favor, that the sea had joined their feast. But none dared throw the fish back. They scooped them up, gutted them, ate them, their mouths still tasting of the night before. And yet, satisfaction did not last. Once a line is crossed, the appetite does not fade. It sharpens, it beckons. That night, as they lay in their bunks, men found themselves staring at one another in the dim lantern light. Not at their faces, but at their limbs, shoulders, thighs, arms, portions. By the next week, no one waited for the sea to provide. The first selection was clumsy. Voices raised, fists drawn, accusations hurled. A fight broke out on deck, men clawing at one another like animals. In the end, blood spilled anyway. And blood, once spilled, led to knives, and knives led to the same silent fire, the same grease, the same chewing. It was then that the ritual was born. To ease the horror, to lend order to madness, they agreed on lots. Straws cut from rigging lines drawn one by one. Whoever drew the shortest was marked. Not always killed outright. Sometimes beaten first, sometimes pushed toward despair until he gave himself up. But always, inevitably, Granger did not stop them. Perhaps he could not. A captain can command discipline, can enforce rules, but hunger makes its own law. And so he allowed it, standing apart, clutching his silver charm, whispering to himself that it was temporary. That once they reached safe waters, once they found land, it would be forgotten. But the truth was already carved into the planks of the Mercy. The ship was no longer a vessel of commerce. It was a vessel of consumption. With each feast, the men grew quieter, stranger. Their eyes took on a gleam, not of shame, but of anticipation. Jokes were made in poor taste, half laughed, half meant. One man muttered that the flesh was sweeter than pork. Another said it filled the belly better than fish. Each time, others laughed nervously, but they still ate. The shoals seemed to encourage it. Each time a body was consumed, the sea stirred. Fish gathered in droves. Sharks circled closer. The whales, those silent witnesses, tightened their ring around the brig, their massive shadows drifting just beneath the surface. It was as though the ocean itself had become a participant, feeding when they fed, watching when they watched. Discipline collapsed. Work on the rigging slowed. Sails tore and were left unmended. The deck grew filthy, slick with stains the waves could not wash away. Men no longer sang at the capstan or whistled in the rigging. They muttered, they stared, they drew lots. By the fourth feast, it no longer felt like necessity. It felt like tradition. And that was the true horror. The mercy of Providence had crossed an invisible line, not of geography, but of morality. There was no going back. They were not merely sailors trapped by hunger. They were something else now. Something the sea had shaped. Something the shoals had demanded. When 17 sailors ate that first night, they thought they had bought themselves time. What they did not understand was that they had entered into a bargain with the ocean itself. And the sea, patient as ever, always collects its debts. When hunger first drove them to the body the sea delivered, it felt like accident. A grim mercy, a single moment of relief. When they drew lots the first time, it felt like madness. But by the third, and certainly by the fourth, it no longer felt like either. It felt like order. Sailors are creatures of habit. They live by bells, by tides, by the endless repetition of tasks. Haul the line, trim the sail, scrub the deck. The rhythm of life at sea is what keeps men sane in an environment that would otherwise break them. But when discipline collapses, something else rushes in to fill the void. And aboard the mercy of Providence, what replaced the old rhythm of shipboard life was the rhythm of death. The system was simple, almost absurdly so. Straws cut from rigging line. 17 men standing in a circle, drawing one by one. The shortest marked the loser. The others, the survivors. It was crude, but it carried with it the illusion of fairness. Better to believe fate had chosen than to accept that knives and suspicion alone decided who lived and who died. Once chosen, the man was set apart. At first there were tears, begging, bargains offered. A man would promise to work harder, to eat less, to give up his ration of water. But what can promises weigh against 17 pairs of eyes, each one hollow with hunger? A promise cannot feed. Flesh can. And so, inevitably, the chosen fell. Sometimes quickly, a knife drawn across the throat in silence. Sometimes slowly, beaten until breath failed. And always, afterward, the fire. The ritual carried its own perverse comfort. It was no longer a frenzy of fists and chaos. It was structured, almost ceremonial. Men who had once hauled sails together now shared the weight of preparing the body, dividing the portions, cooking the meat. The act was horrific, yes, but the structure dulled its edge. It felt inevitable, almost ordinary. Captain Granger watched it unfold with the hollow eyes of a man who has lost his command. He told himself the system kept order, that by allowing the ritual, he prevented worse chaos. He told himself it was necessary. Captains are good at telling themselves stories when the truth is unbearable. But deep down, even he knew the Mercy was no longer a ship. It had become a floating tribunal, a place where hunger served as judge, jury, and executioner. The men began to change in ways not visible at first. Their bodies remained gaunt, their cheeks hollow, their ribs sharp against their skin. But their eyes took on a gleam, not of health nor of hope, but of expectation. Each drawing of lots was met not with dread, but with a strange anticipation. Men joked darkly about who might be next, laughed at the trembling hands of those pulling their straws. Humor at first, nervous and brittle. But soon the laughter grew more genuine, as if they had accepted the game as simply another duty of life at sea. They spoke of portions as if speaking of cargo. "Enough to last 3 days," one man muttered after a feast. "4, if we're careful. They debated which cuts gave the most strength, which parts cooked quickest, which held the most marrow. These were no longer the conversations of sailors. They were the conversations of butchers. The shoals seemed to conspire in their dissent. Each time the ritual was carried out, the sea responded. Fish swarmed near the hull, sharks circled in greater numbers, the whales drew closer. It was as though the ocean itself approved, as though it fed alongside them, sharing in the bounty. One sailor swore he saw a whale, its great eye staring straight at him through the green glow of the plankton, an eye too human in its patience, as if watching to make sure the ritual was performed correctly. Work on the ship ceased almost entirely. Sails tore and were left ragged. Lines frayed and were not replaced. The men no longer cared for progress. They cared only for the next drawing of lots, the next fire, the next moment when the gnawing in their bellies would subside. By the fifth ritual, something darker had taken hold. It was no longer enough to eat. Now there were whispers of preference. Men spoke of tough cuts and sweet cuts, as though describing pork or beef. The chosen man was no longer a shipmate, but a resource. And resources are meant to be divided, managed, consumed. Granger's authority was now a shadow. He still wore his captain's coat, still polished the silver charm around his neck. But his orders went unheard. He no longer commanded a crew. He presided over a tribe, and the tribe answered to hunger alone. There was one night, near the end of June, when Granger attempted to halt the ritual. He stood on the quarterdeck, voice hoarse but firm, declaring that enough was enough, that the sea would punish them if they continued. His words were met with silence. Then, slowly, 17 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Not in defiance, not in mutiny, but in something colder. Calculation. For a heartbeat, Granger thought they would draw lots and mark him instead. For a heartbeat, he was certain the silver coin around his neck would be the last thing he touched before their knives. But they relented. Not out of loyalty, not even out of respect. Only because the ritual demanded fairness, and fairness required straws. And so, Granger was spared. But he knew then that he was no longer their captain. He was simply another portion weight. The ritual grew slick with repetition. Straws cut, lots drawn, loser marked. The chosen separated, the fire prepared, the meat divided. It was done with efficiency, with routine. No more hesitation, no more shame. It was as though the crew had discovered a grim new order of the sea, one more ancient than any admiralty law. By the sixth time, the men no longer whispered prayers over the body. They no longer muttered apologies. They ate with steady hands, chewing with grim satisfaction. Some even smiled. It was then that the mercy of Providence ceased to be a ship adrift. It had become something else entirely. A floating altar upon which men offered men to the hunger that ruled them. A system of sacrifice, a ritual of survival. And the sea watched. Always, the sea watched. By the end of June, there were 17 left. 17 hollowed men, gaunt as shadows, pacing the deck of a ship that no longer sailed, but drifted. The sails hung in tatters. The rigging sagged. The compass spun aimlessly. The mercy of Providence had ceased to be a vessel of trade, or even of travel. She was simply a raft of wood adrift in a sea that had claimed her already, though the men upon her had not yet admitted it. The ritual had carried them this far. Lots drawn, losers chosen, fires lit, flesh divided, bones cracked for marrow. Each time, hunger receded just enough to allow another day. And yet, with each passing feast, something inside them slipped further. Their eyes grew bright, not with hope, but with a kind of fever. They no longer muttered prayers. They no longer glanced skyward. Their world had shrunk to a circle of wood and a circle of straws. And then came the night when the system itself broke. The lots were drawn as they always had been. Straws cut, passed hand to hand, drawn one by one. But when the shortest straw fell into the hand of Thomas Brigg, a sailor no older than 20, Something cracked. He stared at the straw in disbelief, then at the faces around him. There was no pity in those faces. No hesitation. Only hunger, sharp and naked. Brigg dropped the straw, turned, and bolted across the deck. He screamed as he ran. Not words, not pleas, just raw sound, high and desperate. Men lunged after him. Feet pounded on the planks. The ship shook with the force of bodies crashing into one another. And for the first time, the ritual was no longer orderly. It was chaos again. They caught him at the bow. His hands gripped the rail until his nails tore free. His screams split the night, carrying across the water. And then they stopped. At 2:14 a.m., silence fell. Silence so thick it seemed the sea itself was listening. 17 men were alive when the screams ceased. By dawn, none remained. No one knows precisely what happened in those final hours. The accounts that trickled back, fragmented, contradictory, were the recollections of men half mad with hunger and horror. But some details repeat. They speak of fighting that did not end with the death of Brigg. They speak of knives flashing in the dark, of men turning on one another without waiting for straws. They speak of frenzy, of the ritual abandoned in favor of raw chaos. One sailor claimed that by the end, men were gnawing before the fires were lit, teeth tearing into flesh with animal desperation. Another swore he saw Captain Granger himself dragged to the deck, silver charms still around his neck, his face twisted not in fear, but in weary acceptance. Whether he was spared or consumed, no one can say. His name vanishes from the record after that night. What is certain is this. By morning, the Mercy of Providence was silent. Her deck slick with stains the waves could not wash away. Her rigging torn, her sails limp, and her crew vanished. Not 17, not even one. Gone. When a passing schooner found her days later, the ship drifted aimlessly. No men aboard, no sign of struggle beyond the darkened planks. The logbook was missing, the cargo spoiled. The only evidence that life had ever clung to her was carved into the mess table with a marlin spike. The sea eats, and we eat with it. The schooner's crew shuddered at the words. They searched the ship, calling out, listening for any reply. None came. They found no bodies, no bones, no trace of the 17 who had been alive the night before. It was as though the sea had taken them all at once, swallowed them whole. Some whispered that the men had turned on each other until none remained, that the last survivor, maddened beyond reason, had thrown himself to the whales circling silently below. Others insisted the sea itself had risen to claim them, that the shoals do not permit witnesses. But the truth, if truth can be said to exist in such waters, is simpler. Hunger does not leave survivors. Hunger does not share. And in the end, it was not just the sea that had eaten them. They had eaten themselves. The schooner left the Mercy to drift, unwilling to tow her, unwilling even to strip her of wood. Some ships are cursed. Some timbers bear stains that salt water cannot cleanse. Sailors are practical men, but they are not fools. They left her to the shoals, to drift and rot, and whisper her story to the waves. For years afterward, passing vessels reported strange sights in those waters. A ship glimpsed in the distance, sails ragged, hull blackened, drifting without crew. Some swore they saw figures on her deck, gaunt and silent, watching with hollow eyes. Others heard screams in the night when the wind shifted east. The Grey Shoals became a place to avoid, a patch of ocean marked not on charts, but in memory. And in Liverpool, the shipowners filed their paperwork. The Mercy of Providence, lost at sea. A line in a ledger. A loss of cargo, of vessel, of profit. Nothing more. They did not know, or pretended not to know, that the sea had claimed more than timber and trade. It had claimed 17 men, and in doing so, revealed how thin the line is between sailor and savage, between order and chaos, between hunger and madness. The final night of the Mercy of Providence was not a storm. It was not a battle. It was simply the end of a bargain. The sea had fed them, and in return, they had fed the sea. And the shoals, silent and patient, still wait for the next ship greedy enough to cut through their waters. The sea is patient. It has always been. It does not rage out of spite, nor calm out of mercy. It simply is. Men write poems about it, sing shanties, curse it, fear it, worship it. But the sea is not listening. It balances its own books, keeps its own accounts. And on the Grey Shoals in the summer of 1834, it collected 17 men with the same indifference that it swallows driftwood or coins dropped overboard. The mercy of Providence did not sink. That is what unsettled sailors most. A wreck, at least, has dignity. A broken hull beneath the waves, a grave for those inside. But the Mercy floated, empty, silent, abandoned. She drifted as though mocking the very idea of survival, her timbers groaning, her rigging whispering against the wind. No bodies, no bones, just absence, as though the men had never existed at all. Those who found her refused to linger. They boarded only briefly, just long enough to confirm what they already feared. The decks were stained, the air foul, the mess table carved with that dreadful sentence. The sea eats, and we eat with it. A line etched deep, not scrawled in panic, but inscribed with deliberate care. Words chosen to endure. The schooner's captain ordered his men back to their vessel, refusing to tow the brig or salvage her timber. Cursed, he said, marked. A ship touched by the shoals is no ship at all. Better to leave her drifting, a warning to any fool who might cross that path again. And so the mercy of Providence was left to wander, a ghost of wood and memory, rocking gently in the endless tide. Sailors are not men of letters, yet their stories endure more stubbornly than official reports. In taverns from Liverpool to Boston, from Lisbon to Barbados, whispers of the mercy grew. Some said the crew had all turned cannibal and, unable to face themselves, leapt into the sea as one. Others swore something in the water had claimed them, dragged them down whole, leaving the ship as bait for the next passing crew. A few went further still, muttering that the men had not died at all, but been transformed, taken by the shoals, remade into something that still roams beneath the surface, pale and toothy, waiting for ships to drift too close. What is certain is that no one ever saw the crew again. Their families waited in Liverpool, wives scanning the harbor, children clutching railings, but no man returned. Letters went unanswered, wages unpaid. Lives ended not with funerals or graves, but with silence. The sea keeps silence better than any coffin. Captain Elias Granger's fate was never written. Some said he was the last to die, carved and cooked like the rest. Others believed he leapt into the arms of the circling whales, silver charms still around his neck, accepting his punishment with grim resolve. And there were those who insisted he alone survived, though they could never agree how. In one telling, he drifted ashore weeks later, raving, starving, clutching his coin and whispering about eyes beneath the water. In another, he was taken by the sea but lives still, immortal, condemned to wander the shoals as captain of a phantom crew. Whatever the truth, the mercy of Providence became more than a story. It became a warning. Sailors avoided the shoals, steering wide even when it cost them weeks. Charts marked the region not with soundings but with skulls, with crude drawings of teeth. Ships that vanished there were not said to be wrecked, but eaten. For decades after, mariners swore that on nights when the water glowed with plankton, you could hear screams carried on the wind. Screams that stopped abruptly at 2:14 in the morning. The sea does not bargain kindly. It gives, but it always takes. On that voyage, it gave flesh to 17 starving men. And in return, it took them all. What unsettled the world most was not the horror of cannibalism, though that was horror enough. It was the reminder of how thin the line is between sailor and savage, between order and chaos. Men like to imagine themselves civilized, restrained by law and faith. But strip away food, strip away hope, and even the proudest captain, the sturdiest sailor, becomes prey to appetite. The sea knows this. The sea has always known. For what is a ship, really, but a fragile box of wood set adrift on an endless hunger? Every voyage is a gamble that the ocean will let you cross. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes, as with the mercy of Providence, it allows you just far enough to reveal the truth. That survival has less to do with seamanship or faith than with how long a man can hold out against the gnawing inside him. Years turned to decades, but the story never died. Captains warned new sailors in hushed tones. Old hands muttered of the Grey Shoals when the wind fell silent. And whenever a man vanished overboard, whenever a ship drifted home empty, the words carved into the Mercy's table returned to mind. The sea eats, and we eat with it. It is easy on land to laugh at such tales, to dismiss them as seafarers' exaggerations, drunken myths, or campfire stories stretched beyond recognition. But anyone who has stood on a night deck staring into endless black water knows better. The ocean does